Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Outside the Box. Outside the Box is our seminar series where we thematically explore the interdisciplinary nature of CCS, CCS being carbon capture and storage. This in order to really perhaps grasp the breadth of CCS and how in order to realize it and make it happen, we need to think outside the box. The theme for today is legal aspects of CCS, and someone who knows far more about legal aspects is going to be leading the seminar today. So with that, I'm going to turn the word over to Associate Professor Cathrine Banet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, and welcome to this seminar. As said, the topic for today is climate emergency and the legal response to it. And legal rules are as important as economic factor technology when we want to solve the climate mitigation aspect, and including the development of new technology and deployment of low carbon technologies such as CCS. The legal framework may put some constraints on the development of CCS projects, but it can also boost some of those projects by providing essential support and not least foreseeability for the operators, for the investors, for the society, the general interest of the public as well. So we aim through the regulatory framework to ensure a sound, transparent and adapted regulatory environment, and as well with the ultimate objective of achieving safe CCS operations. During this seminar, you will hear different legal experts that will cover specific issues that are relevant for the whole chain of CCS, but as well for the projects in Norway. I would like as well to invite you to already send some questions during the presentations, and you can do that both here in the audience, but as well those following on the internet. You can use a Slido, and you can use the following code, event code 5641 for sending your questions, and they will be addressed at the very end during the panel session. So without further introduction, I would like to invite a representative from the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, Sofie, Fogstad, Vold, and Cathrine Riseng, Lyster, who will talk about the Norwegian full-scale project and the latest developments under the London Protocol that they are heavily involved in. So please come forward.
Thank you, Cathrine. Thank you for the opportunity to present here today. My colleague Sofie and I will present the full-scale CCS project in Norway and the latest developments under the London Protocol. First, I'll say a little bit about CCS and the full-scale project, and then Sofie will elaborate on the London Protocol. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as the International Energy Agency, have made it absolutely clear. CCS is one of the necessary building blocks if we are to reach our common climate goals. The special report on 1.5 degrees warming published by the IPCC underscores this yet again. The work on the full-scale project is part of a broad Norwegian strategy, which also includes research and development, research centers, research programs, of which climate is the most important, and international research cooperation, including EU programs. Demonstration, where TCM, the Technology Center at Mongstad, is vital, and the full-scale project, and the three are interlinked. We have a state enterprise for CCS, Gassnova, which is involved in all of them. But today, I'll focus on the full-scale project. The current government platform states that the government has an ambition to realize a cost-effective solution for full-scale CCS in Norway, provided that this incites technology development in an international perspective. Now, what does that mean? I'll get back to that after saying a few words about the project. Just a quick note before that. I've mentioned the government, but there is broad political support for CCS in Norway. All the political parties in parliament support CCS. The different elements in the Norwegian full-scale project are illustrated on this map. We have capture from industrial sources, waste to energy, and cement production. So CCS is not only relevant for hydrocarbons. Transport of CO2 by ship to an onshore terminal at the west coast of Norway, from which it will be transported by pipeline to offshore storage under the seabed. Note from the logos that we have a nice bunch of international companies participating in the project, including Fortum, Heidelberg, Cement, Equinor, Shell, and Total. This is important for many reasons, including ability to execute the project and to spread experience and build business. Equinor, Total, and Shell are cooperating on the studies of the CO2 transport and storage solution for the project, referred to as Northern Lights. In January this year, the very first exploitation permit for storage of CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf was awarded for the block they're studying. And just a few weeks from now, they're scheduled to drill an exploration injection well. Remember, I mentioned the government ambition to realize a cost-effective solution for full-scale CCS in Norway, provided that this incites technology development in an international perspective. And I asked the question, now what does that mean? First of all, cost-effective doesn't mean low cost per ton of CO2 for this project as such. Then many other measures would have made more sense. But the project has to have acceptable costs, and we wanted to make a crucial difference to maturing CCS into commercial use. The government will only do this if they believe that this will be the first of many rather than the last of a few CCS projects. We are aiming for the Norwegian project to work as a catalyst for other European projects. In order to incite technology development, we stress knowledge and technology dissemination. The companies participating work well on this, and there will also be requirements to share knowledge and experience from the construction and operation of the project. Another way to pave the way for further projects is through shared infrastructure. The establishment of a flexible transport and storage solution with excess capacity and low marginal costs can make this an attractive option for storing CO2 from capture projects in Europe. The ship transport provides flexibility to reach large emission points in Europe, which would enable the scale-up of a CO2 transport and storage network open to CO2 capture sites in Europe. In setting up a model, we want to incentivize Northern Lights to bring in additional CO2 volumes to the storage site. The project is actively working on this already on behalf of the partners in the Northern Lights. Equinor entered a memorandum of understanding with 7 European companies in the beginning of September this year. In the picture, you see the CEO, Elde Sætre, signing an MOU with Air Liquide. The MOUs entail cooperation on possible carbon dioxide handling at third parties' premises and on transport to and storage at the Northern Lights site. We recently received the results from the FEED studies from the capture projects. And the transport and storage project is working to complete their FEED studies. Then we'll study the results and prepare for investment decision. This includes a comprehensive quality assessment from an external consultant, which is standard for large state investments in Norway. We are also in dialogue with the EFTA Surveillance Authority regarding state aid for the project. The government has stated that the project will be ready for investment decision in 2020 or 2021. We are now, according to the current plan, on track for a decision next fall, the fall of 2020, in connection with the national budget for 2021. This means that the project can be in operation in 2023 or 2024. We still have some challenges. The results from the FEED studies that we just received and are about to receive have to be acceptable. Will the project make a significant contribution to international use of CCS? This is the crucial question. And how shall we demonstrate this? As I said earlier, the Norwegian political support is there. But a broader acceptance of CCS as a climate mitigation tool and political support to the Norwegian project is very, very helpful, especially considering the importance of adding on volumes from European capture projects. The Norwegian state needs to reduce its costs and risks with the project. Even the Norwegian state has budget constraints. But even more important, willingness to take on exposure is proof that the project is relevant to others than us. And we need that proof. We've said that we'll share risks and costs with the companies in the project. And we are negotiating now, and the result is important. Legendary jazz artist Duke Ellington said, "A problem is a chance for you to do your best." As you can see, challenge number 5, the London Protocol, is crossed out on this list. This challenge was an opportunity for us, the Norwegian state, together with the Netherlands and with support of the UK, to do our very best in finding a way to solve it. From Norway, we were an excellent team from our own ministry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Climate and Environment, who worked on this issue. I will let Sofie, who is the one who put down the biggest effort in solving this, elaborate further on the issue.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cathrine. And is it this one? Is it this one? On the computer. Er det ikke pila? Ja. Lawyers and technical problems. Sorry. Oh, here we go. Yes, so thank you, Cathrine. And I will not spend a lot of time on the why, as I think that Cathrine has made a good introduction to why this has been an issue. However, I will spend some time on the how and the assessments that we made leading towards the Dutch-Norwegian proposal for a resolution. So internally, as Cathrine mentioned, this has been a bit of a coordination matter. The London Protocol, by way of its thematic, safeguarding the marine environment by prohibiting dumping of waste and other matters at sea, is within the responsibility of the Ministry of Climate and Environment. Carbon capture and storage is within the responsibility of the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, which Cathrine and I represent. And then the expertise on international law is held by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and its legal department. And so we had a broad and good cooperation on this question. That's not always a given, but this has been really a sunshine history of good interdepartmental collaboration. And so we started out with assessments made by others. For instance, the IEA report from 2011. It's a bit old, but it lays out many of the options available for interim solutions to the issue of lacking ratifications of the 2009 amendment to the London Protocol. And then we also looked into other papers and assessments, for instance, those made by Ingrid Lombudsvedt, who is here in the audience today, and who has a lot of expertise on this matter. And so the 2009 amendment to the London Protocol was formed and adopted upon an assumption by the parties that it would not be possible to interpret the London Protocol in a way that opened up for export of CO2 for the purpose of geological storage. In our discussions, we quickly landed on the need for some kind of new arrangement or agreement between the parties that could function as an interim solution, pending sufficient ratifications or acceptances of the 2009 amendment. And this led us to the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, Article 25, which is the legal fundament in international law for provisional application. Its first paragraph, Alternative B, is the one that is relevant to this case, and it states that a treaty or part of a treaty is applied provisionally pending its entry into force if the negotiating states have in some other manner so agreed. And so the some other manner so agreed refers back to Alternative A, which states that provisional application could also be relevant in the case where the international treaty holds a provision for this in itself, which the London Protocol does not. So we need to prove, or we needed to make sure that the negotiating states in some other manner so agreed. Yes. And so Article 25 of the Vienna Convention does not give any indication as to how that agreement can be stated. The most important part is to be able to state that there is an agreement amongst the parties. And so we discussed back and forth what form such an agreement might take, and we landed on a resolution. On the one hand, that tool is a well-known tool to the parties of the protocol, so it was something familiar to work with. And secondly, and maybe even more important to us, was the fact that the process of adopting a resolution is an inclusive process, and it paved the way for involvement from all of the parties. And aiming for an adoption by consensus, that was a really important point to us. Okay, so main tasks in advance of the meeting was, of course, to write that resolution, and then we had large discussions with the Netherlands and the UK in order to get together on something that we could propose as co-sponsors. And once we got there, the work was to secure support. And we did a lot of outreach. We used our contact networks, CCS policy networks where we participate, the Norwegian embassies abroad, got instructions to help us share the word and secure support. And also the industrial actors in the project participated quite broadly. Still, we were not really sure what would meet us once we got to the meeting in October, even though we knew that the UK, the Netherlands, and probably Sweden would support us. We still had 50 or 49 other parties to make sure that we're on board. And once we got to the meeting at the parties in October, a very pleasant surprise met us once the agenda item came up. Broad support was stated by many of the parties, and this gave a solid fundament for the work that was to be done in a drafting group. And so the process of a drafting group, or within the London Protocol, you can get a drafting group or a working group, and the difference is that a drafting group cannot change substantially the content of a proposal, but it can look into the wording and formulations as well as the points raised by the plenary in order to get in order to find compromises that all the parties can live with. And the process in the drafting group allows all the parties to work together on the text and improves the ownership for each party to the final text. And from our perspective, that was a large plus, making sure that all the parties actually felt comfortable with the proposal and the content of it. This provides also legitimacy to the adopted version. And as this was an important point to us, it's closely linked to the fact that one of the main aims of the project is to achieve cost reductions and technology development. And it is crucial that further projects actually do come after the Norwegian one, as Cathrine has mentioned. And one important element to that one important element that must be in place is an enabling framework that both the industrial actors and also the authorities feel comfortable with. So just shortly, from the plenary, we got 3 main messages to take back to the drafting group. One was an encouragement for increased or enforced ambitions on information sharing, on experience gained in using the 2009 amendment through provisional application. Secondly, there was a call for enforced language on the need to focus on emission reductions at source in addition to CCS, but making sure that CCS is not a substitute to real CO2 emissions at source. And then thirdly, we had a reference to the 1.5 degree special reports, a report from the IPCC that came out last fall, which some of the parties had some difficulties with. And all of these changes were important with a view to achieve consensus and understanding of the proposal, and we managed to work through them as a consortium, and there was also broad participation in the working group. And so all of this paved the way for a consensus-based adoption. At the end of the week, the meeting of the parties lasts for a week, and so we were nervous till the bitter end. And so now the next steps, first of all, the resolution demands for a unilateral declaration by those parties who wish to apply the 2009 amendment provisionally. And so this is the legal instrument chosen in order to give the resolution effect in a party country. And so once we and other party countries have declared the intention of provisional application of the 2009 amendment, and there is industrial willingness to export or import CO2 for the purpose of permanent geological storage, discussions on bilateral agreements is the next steps on the government side. And so we are just starting to look into this. And the bilateral agreements and what they will need to cover. We don't have the full overview yet, but of course questions like cost sharing, liability, permitting regimes, and monitoring and reporting are some of the natural ingredients to such an agreement. And so finally, that was all that I was planning to say on the London Protocol. And I just wanted to make some advertisement for this website. It holds a lot of information, especially on the technical parts of the project, and gives a good overview if you're interested in more. And so thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sofie. We're moving to another project, this one supported by Equinor and the partners in the Northern Lights project, which in some way overlap as well with the full-scale demonstration project. I'm sure you're going to further develop on this. With no other words of introduction, I please Heidi Egeland, could you please come forward? And Heidi is a legal counsel at Equinor, in charge as well of the Northern Lights projects with other colleagues from the same company, and she will further explain the structure of the Northern Lights project and specifically some related legal issues on it. Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you. So, as Cathrine mentioned, the Northern Lights project is a part of the Norwegian full-scale demonstration project that we've already heard a bit about. Now, for Equinor, this started in 2016 when we were awarded the feasibility study for a storage of CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf. And then in June 2017, we were awarded the FEED studies to continue studying the storage, and it was also later expanded to include the transport scope. In October of 2017, we entered into a collaboration agreement with Shell and Total to collaborate on the study work to see for the possibilities of transport and storage of CO2 on the NCS. So today I'm going to give some introduction to the project. Some of it has already been mentioned, but still it will be a high level of the project. I'll give an overview of the regulatory framework and point to some specific issues, and also explain a bit of how we get from an exploitation permit to actually starting injection and operations, and touch upon the commercial potential. Now, to the project as such. As already mentioned, the Northern Lights project is the transport and storage part of the Norwegian full-scale demonstration project. So that means that we're planning to have a ship to pick up the CO2 that's been captured from the capture sites on the east coast of Norway. That would be liquefied and compressed CO2. Onto ships, which will then sail to the west coast of Norway to our onshore facilities at Naturgassparken, which is outside of Bergen. Here it would be offloaded into intermediate storage tanks before transported offshore. Now, buffering this in intermediate storage tanks means that you have the possibility to continuous flow in the pipeline to the storage site. And the pipeline is about 110 kilometers to the injection facilities on the seabed, which is about 300 meters below sea level. And from there it's injected into the geological storage formation, which is about 3,000 meters below the seabed, so quite deep. And the ships, as already mentioned, is something that we consider a very positive solution to provide flexibility to receive CO2 from other sources from around in Europe, which is CO2 that would otherwise be emitted. Now this picture just basically I included it because it shows a bit more on the subsea installations and the facilities, how this could look on the seabed. And as mentioned, we're planning to drill a verification well in December this year. So that's drilled as an exploration well to verify the understanding that we have of the reservoir. By drilling, you get more samples and could test the understanding. But it's also drilled or set out in such a way that it can later on be converted into an injection well. So you don't need to drill a new well for starting the injection. Now, as mentioned, the collaboration agreement between the three partners covers the study work for this project, but it's also the preparations for the potential development and setting out some principle for discussing the potential joint venture agreement that will hopefully be entered into. And there are currently more than 150 people working on this project from all partner companies. So it's quite a bit of work. And some of this work, of course, includes the legal issues, which are varied and many. So I'll give just a general introduction to the legal, the regulatory framework. And for some of you, this may be well known, but hopefully there is something new for everyone. So the legal basis is the European CCS directive of 2009, which was implemented into Norwegian law in 2014 via the storage regulations, an added chapter in the petroleum regulations, and an added chapter in the pollution regulations. Injection of CO2 into the subsurface is considered pollution, which would be prohibited without specific permits. And the added chapter in the pollution regulations sets out the procedures for achieving such a permit. That being said, we did have injection permit for CO2 prior to this amendment under the pollution regulations, for example, on Sleipner, where we've been injecting CO2 since 1996. The petroleum regulation has a chapter which addresses CCS activity as part of petroleum activity. So that would be what would regulate Sleipner if that was a field coming into operations after 2014. Where you produce gas which has a high content of CO2 and you extract the CO2 offshore and inject it into this subsurface before you send the gas to market. So that's CCS as part of petroleum activities and regulated under petroleum regulations together with the pollution regulations. Now for the Northern Lights project, which is a pure CCS project that's regulated under the storage regulations. And the storage regulations are built up very similar to the pollution regulations. And it's also mentioned in the pre-works that it's intended to be administered in a similar way. And there are, of course, many similarities between offshore injection of CO2 and offshore extraction of petroleum. But there are also some important differences. For example, when it comes to the market, currently there's not really an existing market for storage of CO2. And even if there was, the income potential compared to petroleum production is, of course, very different. And you then don't have the same income potential to offset the risk because there is quite a bit of risk involved in this activities, liability risks. But the similarity with the Petroleum Act and regulations means that for the companies already operating on the NCS, it's a bit familiar, the storage regulation, even though it is new. And this is, to my knowledge, the first project that is actually kind of undertaken under those regulations. So that's new work that we're undertaking. Now this slide just shows the life cycle of a CO2 storage operator. So the Norwegian state, of course, have the exclusive right to exploit the subsea for injection and storing of CO2. So in order for the companies to do this, we need permits in place. So first of all, if you want to search for a potential storage offshore, you need a survey permit. This is a non-exclusive permit and has a duration of up to 3 years. If you find an area you wish to further explore by drilling wells or other measures, you need an exploration permit. Now this is an exclusive permit with a duration of up to 10 years, and you could also get a work commitment under that permit. Now once you have evaluated that this storage is suitable and you want to be able to move ahead to development, you need an exploitation permit. That's also an exclusive permit, which gives similar rights as you get under the petroleum production license. It's very comparable, of course, for a different activity. The storage regulation doesn't really say anything about the duration, but in the pre-works it's indicated that up to 50 years could be a suitable maximum duration. Now, before you can do any development and operation, you need to set out a plan for development and operations, which is the PDO. I'll get a bit back to that, but when you have an approved PDO and you want to start injection, you still need consent, both from the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy and the Norwegian Environment Agency. Now, during the operations phase, there are quite a few requirements, among others related to monitoring and corrective measures if there is leakage or risk of leakage or any irregularities. This is based on a monitoring plan that needs to be updated every 5 years, and it's subject to the Ministry's approval. And this monitoring plan also needs to take into account the requirements under the ETS directive and regulations for measurement of CO2 in case there should be any leakage. During this, the lifetime of the permit, there is, if this is held by several companies jointly, there is a joint liability towards the state for any financial obligations that could arise from the activities. Once you've done with the injection phase and you want to close down, you need a consent to cease operation, and you need to submit a closure plan, a cessation plan. After you've shut down and removed the facilities according to the cessation plan, there is still a liability on the operator for corrective measures, monitoring any CO2 quotas for anything that would leak. Of course, that shouldn't happen, but if it did. And this liability exists until you have transfer of responsibility to the state, which shall happen if there are certain conditions fulfilled, which is that all technical evidence shows that the CO2 will remain contained in the storage. A minimum period have lapsed, which is set in the regulations to be 20 years, unless the ministry accepts a shorter time period. and also that you've done all the removal obligations that you have. Now, at transfer of responsibility, the operator still needs to submit a financial mechanism to the state to cover costs for monitoring for an additional 30 years. So there's quite a long-term obligation and liabilities after you've ceased the operations. Now, the Northern Lights project is currently working on the PDO, and we have an exploitation license. So this is a picture from when we handed in the application for the exploitation license. And we, Equinor, received the license or the permit 11th of January this year, but we were also the only applicant. So the competition was not fierce. So the area that's comprised by the permit is this marked as Aurora here. It's just south of Troll, so the red and the green and red areas, that's the Troll reservoir. Currently there are no petroleum production licenses covering this area, but regulatory, it is possible to have an area covered both by a petroleum production license and an CCS exploitation permit, because they give exclusive rights to different activities. Now, whether there are practical issues, that's a whole other case. So the permit is, as mentioned, awarded to Equinor, but we have a collaboration with Shell and Total, and the intention is, of course, to work together to see if there is possibilities to establish a joint company that can undertake this development and operations, and then transfer the license to that new company. Which brings me to some specific issues under the framework, which is the establishment of a joint venture. So the storage regulations sets out that if a permit is awarded to multiple legal persons jointly, the activities shall be carried out at joint expense and risk, and the enterprise that is thus established shall be regarded as licensee. So the Company Act applies. There is no exemptions as there is for petroleum activities, and you need to establish a company. Now that, of course, brings new kind of legal issues that you don't have in the petroleum activities as to what type of companies should you establish, limited or unlimited liability and so forth. And of course, this is in close dialogue with the ministry, who in the end will approve the agreement. Another item is the operator versus the licensee. So the holder of the exploitation permit is the licensee, and it sets out in the regulations that if a permit is awarded to multiple persons jointly, the ministry shall, as a main rule, designate one of the participants in the licensee company as the operator. Now, the reason this poses some additional challenges is that there are certain obligations and liabilities that are addressed specifically to the operator in the regulations. And some are addressed to the licensee, but there are specific obligations only on the operator. Now, under petroleum activities that we're used to, this is not the case. Then the operator just handles the day-to-day operations on behalf of all licensees on a no-gain, no-loss basis. Whereas here, there are certain specific requirements, among others, the financial security prior to start of injection, the financial mechanism prior to transfer of responsibility, and the monitoring responsibility throughout and also after closure. Now, the EU directive does not operate with this distinction. The directive sets these obligations on the operator, but it does not mention licensee. So the term operator under the directive actually covers what is defined both as licensee and as operator under the Norwegian legislation. Now, the directive also doesn't really mention the case where multiple companies apply jointly for an exploitation permit, but that could be solved by setting up a company beforehand, as we, under the Norwegian regulations, need to set up a company at award. So that's just one of the challenges that we have looked into. Now, how do you get from award of an exploitation permit to actually starting injecting CO2 and start operations? Before you can do anything, any development, you need to submit the PDO. And the PDO needs to contain both a description of the development as such and an impact assessment. Now, the impact assessment is currently on hearing, so that's publicly available and anyone can comment on it, and the deadline for that is 15th of January 2020. The impact assessment is based on an assessment program that's been established by the MPE, but that's, again, based on input and proposals from the licensees. There is not a specific approval for the impact assessment in itself, but it is part of the PDO, and the PDO is subject to approval. And also in handling the PDO and evaluating that, any comments that's been received during the hearing, of course, needs to be looked into. Now, the description in the PDO shall address both financial, resource-related technical aspects, safety, commercial, environment, etc. It also needs to address any permit required under other legislations. One of these is the Planning and Building Act, which sets out a requirement for a zoning plan for our onshore facilities, so the plant, the harbor, and also part of the pipeline, which is up to 1 nautical mile from the sea-land border. So there is a zoning plan program that's already been approved by the affected municipalities. There's 2 municipalities affected by this. It's Øygarden and Fedje, and they have a combined zoning program. Also worth mentioning that the ship is not covered by the storage regulation, and therefore the requirements to the PDO, etc., doesn't really comprise the ship transport. A few words on the commercial potential of the project, which is, of course, very important, and as already mentioned by the MPE, we wouldn't be doing this if it was only for the Norwegian demonstration volumes from the East Coast. Of course, it's important to store that, but we need to scale up. And we have initiated dialogue with a number of potential customers, and there were the memorandums of understanding signed in September this year with 7 potential customers. So we are working jointly with them to see if there are possibilities. And since we are still at an early stage, we haven't established a company together with our partners for these activities. So any dialogue that we have with the potential customers needs to be in accordance with competition law requirements. So for that reason, we've set up a clean team that's handling this to ensure compliance. Now, both the storage regulations and the CCS directive ensures third-party access on objective and non-discriminatory criteria. In the storage regulations, it's very similar to what we're familiar with from the Petroleum Act, just without the specific regulations that applies there to third-party access. But it is setting out some principles on fair and non-discriminatory criteria, and as long as there is capacity, you could also be imposed to expand the capacity, and any third-party agreements are subject to ministry approval. And the London Protocol, as we have heard, very good news for us, is that that's no longer an obstacle. So now the regulatory framework really makes it possible to achieve third-party customers from across Europe. Now, one issue that is still unresolved is the ETS and ship transport. It could be resolved. It could be that it's not. It's based on interpretation. The reason it's an issue is that the ETS directive sets out that you can subtract emissions from any CO2 that's been transferred to a transport network or directly into storage for permanent storage. Now, transport network is defined in such a way that it doesn't include ship. Also, the ships are not ship transport of CO2 is not an activity under the ETS directive, which means that if CO2 were to emit from the ship, it wouldn't be subject to ETS quotas. At the same time, you could argue that once the CO2 is later on delivered, to the storage, it should be possible to subtract the emission quotas then, and also it wouldn't be emitted, which is, of course, a prerequisite for quotas on the ETS directive. So it's still considered an unresolved issue, but we're hoping that it should be possible to solve with this interpretation. Also just mentioning that the Northern Lights project have been a so-called project of common interest since 2017. And as of March this year, we submitted an extended application which included several more both capture sites and potential new storage sites, which is now been put forward by the European Commission to the Parliament and Council under a so-called non-objection period. So we hope that we will then, after that is approved, be eligible for Connecting Europe Facilities funding. Yep. So that was a quick run-through of some of the legal issues that we're working on, which are, of course, many and various.
Heidi, thank you very much for this very useful insights into the project and the legal as well aspect of it. I would like to remind you that you can send questions for the panel debate at the very end using Slido, and the code is 5641. So please do so we can gather the questions. Actors are involved in the CCS projects that create opportunities, but how do we put together the actors and create a network of projects? And therefore, how do we work on business models? That's something that the organization Zero Emission Resource Organization, has been working on with the release of a report on the business model. And we have one of the main advisors on the issue, Camilla Svensson Skriung, who will give us an introduction to that report. Please, Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. So, I am going to talk about new business models for CCS. And in a way, this is an answer to the number 4 question or challenge that the department raised earlier on, which is the sharing of cost and risk in a way, and also the need to find a way to make CCS financially viable on a mid and long term. So, we know that CCS is needed along other climate measures to get to the Paris Agreement goal. And the good news is that actually, or you can say it's good news. It's great potential in this because waste stands for 5% of worldwide emissions actually, and cement also the same. And you can have carbon capture on those emission point sources. So the background for making a study in Zero on business models is the fact that the ETS is not effective enough to make CCS financially viable. And we need some ideas on how to do this. How are we going to make it possible to do CCS without state subsidies? So that's one of the reasons why we did this. Because here in Norway, we have been doing and planning CCS for many years. And the Norwegian project is kind of unique. And we know that Europe sees to Norway, look to Norway these days. It's actually here, it's a happening. So it's a unique project, and the plan is to capture from Norcem and Klemetsrud, as you all know. And it will be the first CCS project on industry. So that's something to be proud of. And also the fact that European industry can access this storage site and store CO2 there. But there are some challenges, as I mentioned. The fact that carbon capture is very politically vulnerable. We have this investment decision discussions over the state budget. It's very politically vulnerable because it's kind of a competition between hospitals and schools, etc. And we don't need that kind of discussions on a long term. Every year we can't have that. It's a very large challenge. So we need business models for CCS to make state subsidies on a long term not needed. How are we going to do that? So we made a study this winter in Zero. We had some criteria on what kind of business models would actually spark CCS. And the main idea here is to follow the products from the industry, if you get the idea of that. The products that the industry are making, like cement, steel, aluminium, etc. The product in itself could be followed with some kind of legal and political and financially measures. Instead of focusing only on the CCS technology and how to finance that, we can actually find a way of sharing the costs in between the buyers of the products. So that's the underlying thinking of this. So we need to make early markets and drivers for this kind of industry and pass the cost to the buyers. And it should be an incentive for the new projects coming, which is very important. And we need business models that are transferable across sectors and countries as well. It should be not only for the Norwegian legal measures, but can be applied other places as well. So we looked into existing measures that could be used also for CCS. For example, green requirements. That's a very known, established requirement scheme. This can also be used for a product coming from industry that can provide zero-emission products. So you could, for example, weigh the products that come from zero-emission projects so that they are favorized. You can have a bonus, for example, per effective climate solution. And this is a very good way of doing this because we have a focus now in cities, in the public, in the state, and also in the private sectors, that when we buy something, we have a great power when we buy materials, etc. And we should use that power to ask for zero-emission products. And actually 40% of all concrete goes through that kind of big requirements, procurement systems, and 70% of all municipal waste can also be underlying these kind of schemes. So that's one. And we looked into something kind of similar. Many businesses now are very keen to actually use their power to ask for more climate-friendly solutions. And we were curious if we could do this on CCS too. And that's very possible to do. You can just imagine large companies, even public companies like Statsbygg, building a new museum or whatever, asking for zero-emission concrete. That would really spark a market. So that's using the power that you have in buying the materials. But you can also make a scheme of taxations favoring emission products, which favors the ones that are doing capture projects. It can be a tax, for example, on burning of waste, so that when a municipality delivers waste to a place where they don't have capture project, they will be taxed. But if they deliver later on, after 2023, to Klemetsrud, they will not. So it's a way of favorizing. And we looked at 2 other countries where they have done this, and it must be applied along with tax on border, on exporting of waste outside of the country. That's important. Otherwise, you will have that waste is exported. So it must be combined. You can also put tax on the use of concrete. And the idea is that Norway, for example, will see that they will have a market for this. They will have a competition advantage in this kind of scheme. It's a new way of seeing the polluter pays principle. So we have tax on the concrete, which is not zero emission concrete. And then you can also use already existing framework for the responsibility when it comes to the production of a material and how it's used, and if it's recycled or not, and how it's treated as a waste. You can use that for CCS as well. And that's called extended producer responsibility. It's already in place for plastic, for example, that the producers of different kinds of plastic materials must take responsibility of how the material is used later on, and they pay a tax into a fund which you can get money from if you are into this scheme. That can also be used for CCS actually, and seeing how this kind of material is taken care of as waste. Is it sent to a facility that has a capture project or not? And this can also spark a market for CCS. And this is also broadening the thinking around the CCS. It's possible to work further with the climate requirements in the so-called tech for buildings, so that you will have requirements when you kind of a way in the same as the procurement system, but this is more to promote the building of buildings with zero-emission material. this is maybe not so effective for CCS because it's going to take time to implement this kind of rule. So the idea is, as I said, when you follow the service like waste or the product, you can actually share the costs, and the cost will become lower. And we were wondering, which is very important, what would be the cost if you actually imply some kind of rule that you want to buy. You will put a criteria in the procurement when you build a road or a bridge or whatever. Will it be very costly for the public or for the private builders? And we found, and it's also built on a study done by Chalmers in Sweden, that it is costly, the capture project in itself. It's at the moment 8% added on. But if you buy the concrete, the cement, it's 40% more expensive. When you use the cement in a project, in the concrete, it will only be 1 to 2% more expensive. And that's, we found that the public and the private buyers of cement are actually willing to do that. And the reason why it's not so costly is it's only part of a project. It's only a part of the materials being used. You have all kinds of, you have steel, tree, and you have also the payment for wages, of course, and the project planning, etc. So in itself, it's not that costly. And then you have the price for the extra price for waste. That would be more costly for the renovation fee in a city or in a municipality, between 20 and 40% extra. So you will need to ask your city or your the ones living in the city if they want to do that. And to my knowledge, people are really keen on making an effort to contribute to this kind of waste management. So the conclusion is, for the first project, for the full-scale project here in Norway, for the building of the infrastructure, we need, of course, the state to realize their own goals and make a state investment decision. So for the first project, we need state subsidy. But for the next ones, we will need to build a market to make CCS financially viable. And as you can see here, it's the more blue, the dark blue, the more, that's the timing of these kind of measures. So EU ETS will not work efficiently in a while, but our recommendations could work in the meantime to spark CCS and make a market for these kind of projects and products. So that's it. Thank you.
Camilla, thank you very much for bringing the issue of business models, not only for the next projects, but the next generation of project after those mentioned earlier with the full scale and Northern Lights. The next session is a series of pitches from the University of Oslo, the Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law of the Faculty of Law. And we will go a bit deeper in some of the issues that have been identified during the 3 previous presentations. We will have presentation from research assistant Johannes Dalen Giske on low carbon products and how public procurement rules can incentivize them. Then we have a presentation on liability aspect of CCS, both for storage and shipping, with postdoc Viktor Weber. Then Heidi Sydnes Egeland is going to review for us how CCS is covered under the EU ETS and what are the legal consequences of the different methods for transporting the CO2. And finally, I will touch upon the issue of public aid, state aids, and how CCS activities are covered by EU state aid rules. So please, Johannes, you're first in line.
Thank you, Cathrine. Good morning, everybody. As she said, my name is Johannes, and I'm researching whether the public sector can use procurement to grow the market for low-carbon products and how it might go about doing so. I want to start by showing you some big numbers. With the public sector using this much money and in the process becoming responsible for almost a sixth of the Norwegian climate footprint, it should be clear that green public procurement could be a vital step on the road to reaching the Paris goals. And when the public sector goes green, it can really make a difference. The large increase of clean energy buses here in Oslo is a good example, because public entities like Lyster are large market actors and can signal that they're in for the long term. And this reduces risk for companies on the forefront of green development and paves the way for others. Now, if ordinary people or private entities want to buy climate-friendly products, we are free to do so. And we can decide for ourselves how much we are willing to pay extra for those qualities. So why can't the public sector be as free with its spending? To start off with, public entities exist as tools for a public good and not to further their own self-interests. That's why we need rules to make sure they act in the common good, both when they exercise public authority and when they use public funds. In addition, the EU public procurement regime is part of the larger European integration project, and the freedom of movement are central EU principles. Reducing barriers to trade is an important goal, and public procurement has traditionally been quite a national affair, so it would probably stay that way if it weren't for mechanisms that specifically counter it. Now, let's talk about the tools that a contracting authority can use to influence the outcome of a procurement. To start off with, there are ways of specifying what you want to buy. The most important of these are the technical specifications, which describe the characteristics of the goods, services, or works that you are looking to procure. If a tenderer wants to compete for the contract, they have to deliver on the specifications. Secondly, there are ways of specifying who you want to buy from. These are called selection criteria and are intended to make sure that the tenderers competing for the contract are sufficiently qualified to fulfill it. And finally, the contracting authority can influence which tenderer is picked in the end. This is done through award criteria, which are statements about the grounds the contract will be awarded on and how different criteria might be weighed against each other. In my thesis, I'll be focusing on the first and the last of those, but due to the time restrictions today, I'll only be talking about technical specifications. So, to what extent can you use technical specifications to increase the use of low-carbon products? As a starting point, environmental requirements are explicitly mentioned as a subgroup of technical specifications. And the contracting authority, even in some cases, has a duty to consider the environmental consequences of its procurement. So the room for environmental requirements in general is quite large. However, in the case of low-carbon products specifically, two limitations must be dealt with. Firstly, there is a proportionality problem. Specifications are not allowed to create unjustified obstacles to competition, and if they refer to characteristics that are not part of the material substance of the procurement, they must be proportionate to its values and its objectives. A low-carbon product, like cement produced with CCS, has no effect on the material substance of the contract. This bridge, for example, is going to be exactly the same bridge with exactly the same characteristics, regardless of the fate of the CO2 involved in its creation. So the proportionality principle would apply in this case. And proportionality tests are not a rare thing under EU law. The question is briefly put whether a measure is appropriate and necessary to reach the stated goal, and whether that goal is legitimate. As to the result of this specific proportionality test, ask me again when I've finished writing in June, and I might have an answer for you, hopefully. Secondly, except under a few well-defined circumstances, a contracting authority cannot refer to a specific process, make, source, or origin if this has the effect of favoring some products or tenderers at the expense of others. This rule is justified by the principles of competition and effective use of public funds. Referring to a specific process or make might exclude potential tenderers who can deliver a product that actually fulfills all the needs of the contracting authority, but won't because of the requirement. Therefore, in the rare case that a contracting authority is allowed to refer to a specific process, it usually has to add the words "or equivalent" to the end of these referrals to make sure that tenderers can choose a better solution, if there is one. So, what does this mean for the contracting authorities that want to incentivize the use of low-carbon products? On one hand, it's unclear whether it can state specifically that it wants the tenderers to use a specific low-carbon product like CCS cement. This would at least be subject to a proportionality test, and if other suppliers could produce equivalent cement with the same CO2 emissions, they would have to be allowed to compete. On the other hand, requiring the CO2 emissions from the individual elements of a work or product to be under a certain level is probably less complicated. And as I'll explore further in my thesis, it's probably a good idea to combine this with the award criteria so that a tenderer who does use low-carbon products can gain a larger advantage over other tenderers. So, to summarize, the potential impact of green public procurement is large, but public entities need to make sure they are not needlessly restricting competition. If they manage that, it can be an important tool to reach the consequential goals to mitigate climate change. Thank you. Do I? Yes.
So does this work? Yeah, okay. So, good morning. My name is Viktor Weber, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the CCS project at the University of Oslo. And today I would like to give you a brief introduction to the liability issues related to the storage and transport of carbon dioxide. So, the storage of carbon dioxide is regulated at the European level. The Carbon Capture and Storage Directive, the Environmental Liability Directive, and the European Emission Trading Scheme Directive provide the main framework. And this framework is applicable in Norway as well, as it has been mentioned before, through the European Economic Area Agreement. Also, this framework is very influential. Beyond Europe, many jurisdictions adopt a similar framework, especially a similar one to the CCS directive. Due to the time constraint, today I will only discuss the CCS directive in relation to this framework. So what are the key points? First of all, storage sites must be assessed, and the storage operation must take place only in accordance with a permitting procedure. Secondly, only CO2 can be stored, so no additional substances can be added apart from tracers or minor impurities. The storage site must be monitored in order to notice any irregularity, and if an irregularity takes place, not to mention leakage, then immediately corrective measures must be followed and the leakage must be stopped. Liability is transferred to the state. This is because of two reasons. First of all, no enterprise is expected to exist into perpetuity, and secondly, no enterprise is willing to take liability for exceptionally long time. There are two important conditions. The first is a prescribed minimum time must elapse, and secondly, and the exact quote is very important, all available evidence must indicate that the stored CO2 will be completely and permanently contained. And finally, the final key point of the directive is that the operator must provide a financial mechanism, a certain amount of money, to cover the various costs related to the storage site, especially monitoring, for at least 30 years. Now, even though the CCS directive intends to make the CCS safer. In the past decade, a lot of challenges and issues have been raised in relation to it. Most notably, these issues are that the period I mentioned before, by default it is 20 years, and scientifically it is often argued that it is unjustified too long and poses an unnecessary burden on operators, and of course unnecessary expenses. The second problem is, and this is why I mentioned that the exact quote is important, the expressions completely and permanently contained and by all available evidence can be interpreted in various ways, and this introduces uncertainty about in what way and on what conditions the state will take over liability in the future. In relation to liability specifically, it must be noted that it is not limited. This is very often raised by the industry as a problem because this makes the estimation of risks very, very difficult, and of course the obtaining of insurance or other guarantee services. Amongst the various types of liabilities, ETS liability is a particularly difficult problem because it is impossible to predict at the moment the future price of emission trading allowance credits. Coming to the carriage of CO2 by ships. So first of all, it must be pointed out that this is a very safe industry, especially CO2, because it is not flammable and not explosive. However, it is an asphyxiant, and it is also carried as a pressurized gas, so it carries several risks nonetheless. To such operations, the common provisions of Norwegian maritime law apply. So liability is channeled to the ship owner, regardless of who is at fault in the first place. Insurance is compulsory, and if liability arises, it is limited through the implementation of the International Convention on the Limitation of Liability for Maritime Claims. In the future, if it comes into force, the Hazardous and Noxious Substances Convention will take over the place of the previous convention with its own set of limits and an additional fund which may cover claims going beyond the limits. Apart from this well-known framework, there are two specific outstanding issues at the moment. The first is the application or disapplication of Article 6 of the London Protocol, which has been described before by Sofie Vold. And secondly, the application of the European Emission Trading Scheme to carriage of by ships, which has been mentioned before and will be elaborated on in more detail by my colleague, Heidi Egeland. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me? Well, I'm Heidi, and I'm here to talk about my research, which is on the carbon capture and storage under the European Emission Trading System, and specifically about the consequences of different transport options for the transport of CO2. Some of the previous presenters have also alluded to the fact that there is a problem here with the EU regulation, and that's what I will be focusing on. So this is my plan for my very short presentation. I will take you through some of the key legal instruments, and then for those of you who do not know what it is, I will explain what the EU ETS is before I dive into the specifics. So the key legal instruments is, as you have heard earlier, the directive on that establishes the European Emission Trading System, and then there is a regulation adopted on the basis of the competence of this directive. And then there's also this safe geological storage of carbon dioxide, which is popularly referred to as the CCS directive, that also contributes some important definitions to these two other frameworks. So the EU emission trading system is a carbon market for trading greenhouse gas emission allowances on a company level. This scope is the EU, but it's also the EEA, which includes Norway and Iceland and so on. It covers certain industrial activities and the aviation industry, totaling about a little bit more than 40% of the total emissions of the EU. it applies the cap and trades principle, which you might have heard of. It's where the cap is put on how much emissions the total industry might emit, and then the cap is divided into allowances, and allowances might be traded. The objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, but also in the most cost-efficient way. And this is one of the key instruments of the EU to reach its Paris Agreement goals. So it's a very important framework. And its relation to carbon capture and transport is firstly that it incentivizes CCS by freeing the entities of the obligation to buy allowances or pay for their emissions if the CO2 is stored. And then secondly, it also holds the CCS installations or the CCS suppliers liable for their emissions under the system. So the application of CCS will not lead to more emissions, because that would sort of beat the purpose. So the main reason why I'm looking at this is that the EU is looking at CCS as if pipeline networks was the only option really for the transport of CO2, or that's what it looks like through these frameworks. But as we've heard earlier today, like the Northern Lights projects, it might apply both ships, but also maybe trucks and pipelines. And then the question is, what does this emphasis on pipelines imply for these projects that employ all of the different transport methods? So firstly, in relation to the right to subtract stored CO2, there is a clear right to do so under the directive for an entity that's covered by the EU ETS. So if you aim to store the CO2, you don't have to pay up allowances for it. But the problem is that in the regulation on the monitoring and reporting, there's a complication because it seems to not allow the transfer of CO2 to other installations than the pipeline networks and the storage sites, which complicates the fact when you transport it to a ship or a truck. And then the question is whether you can interpret this, this regulation in order to make it possible, for example, to subtract it from your accounting in the end, or maybe that the regulation beats the point of the directive, so maybe it's void in some way, or maybe they will lose the right to subtract stored CO2, which would be sad. And then the second obligation that I'm also looking at is very tightly related to the right to subtract CO2, because the whole system, it aims to invoke liability for all emissions. So it aims to invoke liability also for the CCS suppliers, but shipping and road transport is not covered under the scope of the ETS, and it's also not covered under the sector-specific requirements related to carbon capture and storage, which is its own chapter in the framework. So the main question is whether projects like the Northern Lights project will be in non-compliance with the EU ETS system because it employs these different measures of transport, or if there is some way around it, what operator or what entity in this CCS value chain will be responsible for the emissions or the leakage along the way. So that's what I'm looking at. And I aim to provide some solutions, both in the short term and long term, and both from the perspective of the companies that has to adhere to these systems, but also for the national regulatory authorities that need to interpret and apply these regulations. So that's it. Thank you.
And last, we'll talk about the treatment of the CCS support under the stated rules. Because the support from the state will be essential to enable the first CCS projects, at least, and so until CCS becomes a competitive technology, and until we have a market, as has been underlined by Camilla before. And the conditions for such support in the EU and in the EEA are set under EU state aid rules. After a short reminder of the definition of state aid, I will insist on the applicable conditions under current EU state aid rules and how they will shape CCS projects in Europe. First, what is a state aid? In the context of the EU, a state aid is, pursuant to Article 107.1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, any aid granted by a member state or through state resources in any form whatsoever which distorts or threatens to distort competition by favoring certain undertakings or the production of certain goods insofar as it affects trade between member states. This means that there must be elements of state resources, selectivity. It must provide an advantage to undertakings, economic activities, with a real or potential distortion on competition and effects on trade. And state aids are in principle prohibited unless they fall under one of the exemptions covered by the treaty. The need for support, financial support, but as well financial support from the state has been underlined already in this seminar. And CCS is an important climate mitigation technology, but is not yet competitive economically. And those costs represent a barrier to the uptake of CCS. And therefore, the Commission sees that state aid can contribute to fostering the development of this technology and therefore may be necessary. Because EU ETS and CO2 tax may not fully internalize the cost of the greenhouse gases emissions, and that presumes that aid for CCS addresses this residual market failure, and the Commission will take that as a starting point when assessing the possibility of granting an exemption under the state aid rules, unless it has evidence that such remaining market failure no longer exists. And the long-term perspective is to phase out those aid because we will have a market for it. Another point that was made earlier by the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy is that cost-effective project is no low-cost project. So you will still have a cost, but you need to address the long-term perspective and what kind of cost can be reduced. The EU legal framework on state aid control is structured as follows. We have the Article 107 of the treaty, which both define what is state aid, but as well provides for the prohibition of state aid. That's reflected in the EEA agreement in Article 61. The article also provides possible exemptions, notably in the case of paragraph 3C, which is of relevance for us. The General Block Exemption Regulation declares certain categories of aid compatible with the internal market in application of these provisions. It defines some thresholds for the notification and the evaluation of the aid to the European Commission, which will be necessary if the conditions are met. Currently, about 90% of all measures are under that threshold. So there is a clear focus on the biggest measures, and the project we're talking about will probably fall over that threshold and will need to be notified. Environmental section of the GBER mirrors as well the Energy and Environmental Aid Guidelines, the EEAG, where there is no mention of CCS in the regulation. There is a dedicated section on CCS in the guidelines. And the guidelines, in those guidelines, the Commission sets out the conditions under which aid for energy and environmental measures, including CCS, may be considered compatible with the internal market. So therefore, they are particularly interesting and they will shape the future projects. Secondary legislation may provide as well for some conditions. It's not direct in the CCS directive, but it could be some elements of indirect constraint. The main element will be the provision of the guidelines, the EEAG guidelines, and what is covered for CCS project. There are both consideration in terms of threshold for individual notification, as well as what are the common assessment principles, and not least specific rules for certain categories of aid. The former guidelines did cover CCS, so it has been reiterated in the new guidelines, and the threshold is for individual notification, even if there is a scheme in place, 50 million euros per investment project, and in addition, there should not be a competitive bidding process. Then the project must be notified and comply with those assessment criteria. The aid to CCS should contribute to the common objective of environmental protection. Here it is clearly climate mitigation measures. And the guidelines clearly state as well that in some industrial sectors, CCS may currently represent the only technology option able to reduce process emissions at the scale needed in the long term. Both investment and operating aid are covered. Aid can relate to fossil fuels and or biomass power plants and or other industrial installation equipped with CO2 captures, transport or storage facilities. So for example, in the case of biomass, CCS will be relevant, or even individual elements of CCS chain. However, what is excluded is aid for the CO2 emitting installation as such, and cannot cover aid for the cost resulting from the CCS project in itself, but not other parts of the installation not related to it. A second set of criteria is related to the assessment of the distorting effects and what kind of framework must be in place. Here the Commission will assess whether any knowledge-sharing agreements are in place, so that will be a requirement, or at least a wish from the Commission to have knowledge-sharing agreement in place. The Commission will assess whether the infrastructure is open to third parties, so what kind of third-party access, the volumes envisaged, what kind of regime is in place will be essential here. And the last point is whether the support to individual elements of the CCS chains has a positive impact on other fossil fuel installation owned by the beneficiaries or not. So what could be the cross effect in other areas of the business. Final point is relates to the combination of aid and whether there is a combination of aid for that project, and here all revenues should be taken into account, including from other sources of financing. The European Commission has a practice which is primarily related to the early project on CCS when they assessed the support from the state just after the adoption of the CCS directive in 2009. And as well, the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which is in charge of the control of state aid for the EEA agreement, has as well quite a long practice related to the different projects that have been developed in Norway, with in early decisions regarding the Gassnova funding, the test center Monstad, the CCS facility in Koster, or Breivik Norcem. And we have seen a new wave of notifications related to either the same framework grants with the climate demo aid scheme or specific projects such as the concept and fit studies for the full-scale CCS demonstration project and renewal of the financing for the CO2 Technology Center, Monstad. So what are the ongoing process in that area that need to be followed up? First, the guidelines that I mentioned, they have been extended for 2 years. So we are currently in a process of review of the guidelines, and that will be the thing to follow up for the CCS industry. What are the requirements that will be put on the CCS project in the next period? Another thing to look at is, in terms of EU policy, what will be the EU climate change and energy targets for 2030, 2050, and what will be the place of CCS under that target, so in terms of target compliance. The third point will be the EU Green Deal, which is very much at the moment a broad concept that needs consent, including in terms of financing. So how will that influence the financing of renewable energy projects, but as well low carbon energy projects? And finally, what is happening at the court of the European Union should keep us busy, because they have had a tendency to go deeper into the cases with a higher intensity review by the court of the different schemes, and new things may come here that could affect as well the national markets. I thank you for your attention. And all the 4 pitches that you have just heard are part of the research we are conducting at the Faculty of Law as part of the Norwegian CCS Research Center. So keep following us to look at the published publications, so the published results based on this project. So thank you for your attention. And with that word, I would like to invite our external speakers to join the stage and to participate to the panel discussion. We have received already some questions. You can keep sending those on Slido. And now, please come forward. So thank you all for very complimentary presentations and very detailed presentation. We have received a series of questions, and I would like to start by a first general one to each of you. In one word, one sentence maximum, what do you think is the next regulatory challenge in CCS policy? Whisper?
I said something about it. It's long-term financing of CCS and how to meet that challenge.
Long-term financing. Thank you, Camilla. Heidi?
Yeah, it's not a new thing, but I would say the long-term liability continues to be a major challenge.
I was expecting that one. Thank you.
In our opinion, the absolute biggest barrier to realizing these projects has been the issue of the London Protocol. That has just been resolved from our view. So I think that will be my answer.
So there are no barriers?
Of course, there are a number of challenges, but I don't think there are any absolute legal barriers anymore.
So I guess I'll just echo what Cathrine just said. But of course, figuring out the liability, I guess that will be one of the hard questions to solve.
Thank you. And just to give a quick poll in the room, what do you think will be the biggest issue? Would that be long-term financing? Who is raising their hand? Okay, we have few people. Then liability? Yeah, a bit more. And actually, we don't have any more legal barriers, and we need to work maybe on business models. Yeah. Well, liability has still a tendency to mobilize. Okay, let's move to the next question we have received. It's for the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. What are the main challenges related to different legislations in different countries when building a large-scale storage project in Norwegian water? And then I have a sub-question for you, because could Equinor be interested in becoming operator on other continental shelves, such as the UK or the Dutch, or is the Norwegian one the most attractive? So we'll start by...
Okay, I can go first, and then Cathrine, you can fill out. I would like to just flip the question, because I guess at least from a European perspective, we have a lot of the common legal framework, so that gives us a common ground at least for the activities, and then going into the challenges moving ahead, I guess that the negotiating bilateral agreements, that will be a challenge, and hopefully it will be manageable to get some common standards for that as well.
Where do you see that the common European legislation has been implemented differently? Where you see the differences?
Well, the CCS directive, for once, is a directive where you can choose to allow for storage or not. So that's a difference. But I guess that wouldn't make a barrier to cross-border collaboration on CCS, as it only applies to your territory. Well, for instance, with the shipping issue, if we either manage to solve it through an interpretation way or through an opt-in, we will need to see how that process works out. And I guess on this matter, the environmental agencies has also a lot of expertise. But in that issue, it would make sense to get a common framework on how to solve the points of where you render your CO2 to the next operator or to the next liability person.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cathrine?
Heidi? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Do you have a
If
comment?
Cathrine has any other perspectives from the ministry.
I think I'll leave it with that, yeah.
Heidi, would you be interested in becoming an operator on the UK or Dutch continental shelf for the CO2 storage?
Well, that's difficult for me to answer. I'm not really that involved in the company strategies as such. But of course, we are operating globally. We are on the UK continental shelf for petroleum activities. So I don't. I mean, I see it as a possibility, but to be honest, I have no knowledge if that is something we're considering.
Yeah. So I follow up on the issue of the agreements that you mentioned, and we're still in the storage. At the University of Oslo, we have been conducting some research on how to de-risk by law the CCS value chain, and notably would it be by legislation, which is providing for a level field for everybody, or by contracts. And when you're addressing the negotiation towards the agreement, that's de-risking through contracts. Do you think that on the long term, one can agree on some standards agreements in this area, or it's still very specific to each country, to each continental shelf?
You're thinking standard agreements for the establishment of a company?
Yeah, or for the storage, around the storage facility and the operation of it.
So for
Yes,
third-party contracts
yes.
with capture sites?
Yes.
I think for NCS, you could foresee certain standard agreements being developed, being in place. For example, for the company agreement, it's in the pre-works that the standard joint operating agreement that we have for petroleum activities is a good starting point. So something like that could be foreseen. With capture sites, I think it depends a bit because each country has their legislation and their kind of contract traditions and applicable law, so you would need to take that into account. So I think there would be a standard for each jurisdiction.
Good, thank you. A question maybe to all of you. What will the price for storing CO2 per ton will be in relation to the relative price of paying for CO2 quotas? So what will be the optimal price for storing the CO2? Do you have any figures, being lawyers? It's a tricky question for. No?
No, actually not.
This one we will keep for our colleagues in the other department. There is still a question on storage for Equinor. Have you considered storing the CO2 in depleted oil and gas fields instead of planned new sites? What is the balance between depleted fields and new sites?
Well, they're both potential storage sites, so both new site and depleted fields could be used. It's the same kind of geology that applies. A depleted field should also have the same cap rock to trap the CO2. So, yeah, I think that was part of the initial feasibility.
And
looking into
that's part of the assessment that has been done as well.
And we were quite concerned with actually, in the earlier parts of the studies, making sure that Equinor looked at different types of storage options in order to shed light on that.
And that was reflected in the CO2 Atlas as well, which was a very early assessment. Let's move to capture. What kind of information will be convincing proof when it comes to further upcoming capture projects in Europe? And that was a question for the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy.
As I pointed to in my presentation, some MOUs have been signed between the Northern Light projects and different companies considering capture in Europe. These kinds of things are, of course, very tangible And although not very legally binding and at an early stage and in the process of considerations, it's definitely the kind of considerations and commitment that we need to see. I also think it's important going forward that the EU actually has placed more emphasis on CCS, and the work in preparing for a new period for the Innovation Fund, seeing that CCS will have a place in the potential funding there. I think that's important as well.
Thank you. Camilla, you wanted to add something?
That question came from me, actually, because it's kind of frustrating, the hen and the egg issue. You know, it's we need an infrastructure here for CCS to make it happen in Europe. They need to see us realizing the CCS infrastructure to know that there will be a possible CO2 storage. On the other hand, we will not do the investment decision on this until it's we know that there is proof of coming projects. So I would say that it's very important, both things, and also that there is quite convincing work now in different industries in Europe to make capture projects. And it's very promising that you have a broad spectrum of industries wanting to do this and looking to Norway. And that should be, in a way, proof enough, but because they will not do this if they will not proceed with the project. So, yeah.
Let's continue with you, Camilla. In your business models, have you considered the fact that CCS will be assisting industries that supply materials, such as aluminium and cement, to the renewable energy industry?
Yeah.
I'm thinking immediately a life cycle assessment.
I think it's a very good question and important as well. So this is industry that we need also in a zero-emission society, providing steel, for example, for solar projects, solar panels. So it goes together, it goes hand in hand. So it's a very good point.
There is another question here related to the attractiveness of the continental shelf as a storage site. Is the relevant law supportive of receiving CO2 from non-EU countries like Russia?
If there is relevant law?
No, is the law supportive of receiving CO2 from non-EU countries like Russia? If Russia is interested to store the CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf?
Well, Russia is part of the London Convention.
Yes.
So not the London Protocol, but still, as we are signatory to the London Protocol, any country from whom we would import CO2 would need to follow at least the standards set by the London Protocol. And then I guess that from the government's perspective, we would wish to apply the standards that we have in our national regulatory framework.
So we're back to the legal barrier of the London Protocol. Yes. There has been a new letter in the CCS that has appeared in the DBED, the CCUS. What is your take on the utilization as part of the CCS chain? And maybe a question for Camilla.
Yeah. We're doing a study right now on this to investigate the possibilities in this field and also to decide on what kind of role and positioning we do in zero. What I can say now is that it's very important that this is not a delay of the climate emissions. So that the CO2 will be emitted just later on. That's important.
And there are two other questions related to that. The first one is, could the offer to Europe to take its CO2, slow down other efforts to reduce emissions? The question doesn't say where, so let's assume both in Norway and in Europe. So could these offer to store the CO2 slow down other policy measures to reduce emissions?
Is this to me?
To everybody. I think it's a general question.
I think that's something that I've heard being raised as a concern. And I think that the fact is that today we know based on these reports from various organizations that CCS is actually, it's necessary, we need it. It's a supplement to other measures, and you won't achieve the climate target without CCS. So it's a supplement, and whether to some extent it could slow down certain elements, that's of course to be seen, but it's I think mostly it will be a supplement.
It's a bit part of the the public acceptance question or issue that is often raised when we talk to colleagues abroad. So it's whether this would be a prolongation of the fossil fuel age or whether it is needed for other purposes. But I would echo what Heidi just said on the recent reports, giving us very good scientific fundament for the necessity of CCS as one of many climate mitigation technologies that we will need to apply.
Part of the package of measures that can be used, and an interesting requirement that can be set is to have more technology neutral policy where all the technology can be put in competition. We still continue on the aspect of low carbon products. Here there is a question: which industry will come next after cement and waste? Steel, paper, refineries? All of them.
It's hard to say. I think steel maybe could be the next ones. We have projects signing the memorandums on all kinds of industries. So, yeah, it's also chemicals. Other waste companies will come. So it's very promising, actually.
CCS is also a very important enabler for hydrogen, to make clean hydrogen from natural gas.
Yes, and you are heavily involved.
Yes. Yeah.
So can you talk a bit more about what is your approach? It's not very legal necessarily, but it will be more business model around hydrogen and CCS.
Well, I know more about the integration of CCS and hydrogen business, that in order to make the hydrogen, the clean hydrogen from natural gas, you need to separate out the CO2. And when you do that, you need a place to store it. So that's why you need multiple storage sites. And by using hydrogen, you can significantly reduce emissions, for example, in ship transport, if they're fueled with hydrogen instead of conventional fuels and so forth. So I think there's a huge potential there.
Both as production and use of hydrogen.
Mm.
There is a question on green products, and maybe Johannes could answer this one. Could the state buyer require all suppliers to provide CO2 accounting for total emissions for all the products they offer to the state? Should we wait for Johannes' thesis? Or do you have immediate views on that?
Yeah, it will be possible, but you raised some issues which are very important to dive into. And we have handed the study over to the Petroleum and Energy department to further investigate exactly those issues. So it will be exciting when the study comes from you and from the department as well.
We're moving a bit more to policy-related questions. Here there is one. EU seems to be on board the CCS train again. But what about the big emitters such as the US, Russia, and China? Do you want to comment on that? Are you working bilaterally with companies in those countries? Or the US is very active in terms of CCS, such as Australia, China as well. Mm-hmm. So they are doing, and many projects are developed in the United States.
Yeah.
They are very...
They're going forward. The States and Canada have been doing CCS for decades. So, okay, it is for enhanced oil recovery to get up oil and gas further, but still some of the projects actually store CO2 permanently. So they are moving faster than us on this issue.
In Canada as well is something?
Norway has a good cooperation actually with the United States through an MOU. And you have American companies that are testing at the technology center at Fogstad with funding from the DOE, the American department. And there's also cooperation between the TCM and China. So I think we do have some good dialogue and some good sharing of experience with both of those countries.
Maybe to close that panel, a general question. You mentioned public acceptance, and public acceptance is pretty different when it comes to CCS, different in Norway than in other countries. For example, Germany, there has been much more resistance to it. Why more public acceptance to CCS, or why the public acceptance to CCS seems higher in Norway than in other countries?
I can start on that.
Yeah.
I think the introduction of CCS is very vital, that it was connected to the building of 2 gas power plants, and the public didn't want us to build them. That's my impression from the first. And then it was some kind of it was a compromise that we are going to build the gas power plant, but we will have CCS on it later. And in that way, it was a public demand to have CCS to clean the CO2 from these 2 big emission sources. So the environmental movement actually demanded CCS. In other countries, it has been big coal companies introducing CCS in the first place, and they are not the most trusted messengers. So it was different introduction. That's one thing. And also that we have offshore storage and not onshore is very important as well. We don't have it that near. People don't relate that much to CCS.
I think I agree with that. If it's in terms of, I think one of the issues is if it's seen as an alternative to other measures instead of a complement to other measures, but also the fact that we have offshore storage. So if it's a safety concern, then that maybe there is less of a concern because we have it offshore and we have already stored CO2 for quite a substantial amount of time on Sleipner and Snøhvit offshore. And so we've seen that that works very safely.
Risk perception. Very different as well. Right. Do you want to add final comments? Otherwise, yes? No?
No, it's fine. I'm just looking forward to the investment decision for the fall of 2020.
Indeed, we have covered many legal issues. Some of them now look brighter, such as under the London Protocol, but others are ongoing, and there will be different processes in 2020 that will complete with the seminar today. With that, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, the audience, as well, and please follow up our research on the UiO website. Thank you. Have a nice day.